Welcome back to Fossil versus Future. I'm Daisy.
And I'm James.
And today we're going to talk about a topic that I personally get quite guilty about. What about aviation? Flying is one of the most carbon-intensive activities, accounting for around 2.5% of global carbon dioxide emissions. However, aviation's climate impact goes beyond CO2. Since pre-industrial times, aviation has been responsible for around 4% of global temperature rise, with 2/3 of this driven by non-CO2 effects, mainly contrail cirrus and nitrogen oxide emissions. Contrails form when water vapor condenses on soot particles from jet engines in very cold temperatures, minus 30 degrees or lower, creating ice clouds. These clouds reflect sunlight during the day and have a cooling effect, but also trap infrared aviation and have a warming effect. Overall, they have a warming signal, lasting up to around 18 hours. While aviation accounts for a relatively small share of global CO2 emissions, its impact on an individual's carbon footprint is far greater. This is because most people in the world do not fly. Estimates suggest more than 80% of the global population has never taken a flight. For frequent travelers, air travel will likely be their largest source of emissions. For example, a round-trip flight from London to San Francisco emits around 5.5 tons of CO2 equivalents per passenger, more than twice the emissions produced by a family car in a year, and about half of the average annual carbon footprint of someone living in Britain. Aviation remains one of the hardest sectors to decarbonise, as battery technology and alternative fuels struggle to match the efficiency of jet fuel. Meanwhile, demand for air travel is expected to keep growing as global incomes rise, making the challenge of reducing emissions even more urgent.
Yes, Daisy. This one is a challenge. We may need to issue a kind of hypocrisy warning. I have tried hard with this problem to find an honest answer to my own behaviours, and it's difficult. My father was a pilot. My mother was a BOAC stewardess in the 50s, when it was a very different life. I spent my life travelling. I grew up in Lebanon and Singapore and Australia, and no part of me can think that aviation is a bad thing. I mean, it's an extraordinary human invention. Aircraft, the ability to fly from one part of the planet to another is just an astonishing invention. And traveling is fundamentally good. It's good for your knowledge. It's good for your experience of other people's ways of living. There's something one can really celebrate in travel. I can't imagine human beings in some way inhibiting their desire to move, to travel. And if a technology comes along that makes it easy and allows you to see more of the world, it's just very alluring, and it's not going to stop being alluring. And if you have spent any part of your life in a so-called emerging economy, and I wish we could find a better phrase for that, the aspiration to travel is not something you can suppress, and shouldn't really, I don't think. That reveals a point of view right there. I can't see any real prospect of taking a certain type of maybe even Northern European environmentalism and thrusting that upon those who are acquiring the capacity to travel by air now because of the growth of their economies and some more middle-class wealth, if you like. And then at the same time, your stats reveal with total clarity who's actually doing the flying, and it's a minuscule percentage. And I'm in that minuscule percentage, and I've travelled for work. My practice, my whole working life is involved travelling. And yes, went to elaborate attempts to do all of the absolutely best form of offsetting and buying and retiring credits, and multiples of my own emissions. But it's hard to resist the answer that the answer is probably just less, whatever it is, and to find a damn good reason for making a journey by air. There is also a long list, and maybe we should, pass the ball back to you first. A long list of things you can do at the margins. It's a long list. It's not just sustainable aviation fuels, which have a positive effect at the margins. It's not even just the fact that there are now in flight and being tested and going through all the regulatory processes that you would obviously require, a lot of hydrogen and electric drivetrain hybrid aircraft in operation, starting with very small aircraft, but now, there are plenty of aircraft being tested that are, 12, 14, 20 seaters. That's happening too, and that innovation is happening fast. But it's not anytime soon going to be doing long-haul flights. And so this is, as you said, a classically hard to abate sector. Some of the other changes that you would like to see being made are not really to do with technology, they're to do with organization. So we don't fly in the most efficient routes from A to B. We don't do that because, going all the way back to an international legal convention, the Chicago Convention of 1948, you have to have permission to land somewhere, to cross someone's airspace, because it's territory. So you have to agree to be able to fly across airspace, right? And sometimes that is denied. Sometimes it's denied because there's war or some conflict between countries, right? You can't fly over a war zone for risk purposes. But equally, there are people, right now would be a classic example, there's a lot of flights that go around Russia and Ukraine. So we don't fly in the most efficient way. We don't organize our airport landing systems in the most efficient way either. We go around and around and around, and we have basically linear runways and circular holding patterns. Electric vehicles will fly very differently. That's something to watch for the future. Very differently. They take off very, very rapidly, and they can turn very quickly, and they don't need the same runway length. We'll come back to Heathrow. But so we don't do that, and there are a whole bunch of things we could do when they're on the ground to make aircraft movements more efficient, airports more efficient, electrify a lot of the services around airports. We could do that. We can also make sure that when we're managing the traffic flows, that we're taking into account how to best organize emissions, and it makes a difference day or night. And there's a whole bunch of parameters that we don't normally think about that could make marginal differences at the edges to deal with the plain fact that aviation is a growing industry, and the contribution to climate change will increase on current trajectories.
Yeah, before I was researching ahead of this podcast, I didn't know a lot about the route optimization that you were just mentioning, and also, as I was talking about at the beginning, the contrails and the different things we can do to try and tackle those non-CO2 emissions. So Mike Berners-Lee has been writing quite a bit.
He's really good on this.
Yeah, been writing quite a bit about this recently. And night flights, for example, contribute 60 to 80% of contrail warming, despite making up only a quarter of flights, because of what I was describing. And during the day, you get that reflection and that cooling effect, which you don't have at night. So just the timings of flights can make a difference. Also, the altitude of flights and the temperatures.
And the climb rates.
Yeah, fascinating. I mean, it's not going to be a solution to all our aviation problems, but would definitely make a difference. And I saw that in his article that we would need to reroute less than 2% of flights to halve their contrail impact.
That's interesting.
So it's
Mike's really good on these
changes.
Numbers. I'm also thinking, there's some airports that where, just because of where they are, for example, if they're in a mountainous area or you have to climb very rapidly, you're going to use a lot more fuel. The glide paths down into airports, how smooth are they? How long are they? That makes a difference to how much.
Direct flights versus stopping.
Correct.
So what you're saying about the takeoff and the fact that consumes so much fuel, it's actually better to not stop off on your journey. And
you could think of all those journeys you make to save money.
Exactly.
By having more stops. And also say, God, how things have changed. I used to travel with my father in the cockpit. You can't do that these days.
I remember going in and
I used to sit behind him, and but we would stop off because he was flying the plane. Would stop off, and that it was quite normal in those days to say flying from Singapore to have 5 stops on the way to London.
5.
Yeah, and that was a pattern. And in my mother's early flying days, going out to Australia from London, she would take the first class passengers to an ambassadorial reception at the British Embassy in Istanbul and have cocktails overlooking the Bosphorus.
How lovely!
So it's quite glamorous. But, very different.
Do you think there was that awareness of the environmental impact at that point, though?
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
It was just an amazing new technology, and only very wealthy people could contemplate using it. Hence, the first class passengers being taken off to a cocktail party.
Well, first class is another change you can make. If you're flying first class, you should switch to economy because your per passenger carbon emissions is going to be reduced.
Yeah, that's all to do with space.
Yeah.
In the aircraft. I've never been wholly convinced by those analytics. I tell you why, because the front end pays for the back end anyway. The economics of the aircraft
are
such that the people who are paying the huge amounts up front are making sure that the flight goes. Right?
If there were a couple of empty seats,
they're subsidizing the ones in economy. And I know the economics are pretty weird because you've got to burn a lot of fuel just to get off the ground, right? So it matters that there's an efficient use of that space. I get that, but it doesn't matter so much on the economics how much space you allocate to the folks up front because they are paying for the seats down the back.
Okay.
Or they're paying for the lure of less expensive seats down the back.
Yeah. Well, then we have private jets.
And that's a whole different things, yeah.
Huge impacts of private jets. And there are websites tracking celebrities. Well, I'm not sure. I think some of them have been removed by Elon Musk now. Yeah.
Oh, yes, because they tracked him. There's definitely a few of them, aren't there, that track aircraft and mega yachts and things like that.
Yeah.
The sporting world and the entertainment world absolutely thrives on private jets. People playing in golf tournaments or football matches and just whizzing around the planet in private jets. It's just part of that.
Well, concerts and touring. We're both touring, huge music fans.
I know. And, everything that we've talked about can be made use of. Aviation fuel, route structures. Route structures tend to be more direct with private aircraft. But it takes an awful lot of fuel to fly one of those aircraft around. They're not far off Air Force jets, military jets in their consumption because they go fast. I don't know. There's everything that you can do to make an aircraft lighter, more streamlined. All of that's happening. Materials, huge developments in material science. Also some fascinating new wing designs to mimicking biomimicry of birds. Really interesting, more flexibility. There's no shortage of innovation in the industry. It's absolutely full of brilliant engineers figuring out how to do stuff better. But the demand keeps going up. And it's really hard to see that declining in the next few years. So every possible effort has got to be made to either cut out unnecessary, a lot of ego-driven trips, let's face it, very much in the business world. Understand that, know about it. The fact that you can doesn't mean you should. Possibly the arrival of really quite sophisticated video technology that we all use now routinely may well have limited. I don't know what the stats are there, actually. But obviously, during COVID,
I think
stopped.
aviation went back up.
But it went back
COVID.
up again. Yeah, I think it did. Yeah, I think it did. So those patterns of behaviour have changed a little, but not much. And there's still a very strong desire to get on a plane and see somewhere else in the world.
I think alongside improving the way we fly, we also need to improve the alternatives. So for me, I really enjoy train journeys, and my family have done some amazing European train trips. But it's often just so much more expensive. And, taking more time is one thing, but costing 3-4 times as much, that just makes it not a feasible option in many cases. I think
tried in various enterprises I was involved with, we tried specifying, no flights when there's a train option.
Exactly. And I think Spain and France now have
Spain and France do have that,
saying that
if
under
you can get
2.5 hours.
That's right, isn't it? Yeah, if the train takes that, then well, those are good initiatives. I'm all in favour, and high-speed rail is phenomenal. It's a really great way to travel. Better, in my view, for those sorts of journeys. I think it's a superior form of travel.
Yeah, me too.
But, if you run an enterprise and you're counting pennies, that cost differential matters. It really, really matters. In most people's lives, cost matters. But a lot of travel is business travel. And a lot of the travel that we're concerned about is business travel, actually. A lot of the air travel that you might want to limit or rethink is coming from businesses. And if the cost differential is as big as it is, often quite significantly more expensive to take the train, then you fly.
And there is the time element as well. I think there are some companies that now allow you to take the time outside of your holiday allowance in order to take the train.
Yeah.
I think it's still quite rare, but giving you an extra day allowance in order for you to complete your journey by train.
Yeah. I would say that'd be a minority of company, though.
Definitely. But then I work for an American company, and so I work fully remotely, and I don't see my colleagues very much because we're an environmental consulting firm. We don't want to fly all the time, but it's really important to meet people face to face. It makes such a huge difference when I meet a client,
of course,
and just have a face-to-face conversation with them. It just changes the whole working relationship going forward.
We had this discussion over the COPs, and the standard every year, boring joke about how many air miles are used to get people there. But come on, you're trying to organise a process to figure out how to solve an unbelievably complex problem, and you want to do that all remotely. I mean, for goodness sake, you've got to meet in person. And it matters who's there. It matters that there are people who bear witness to the decisions that governments make. It matters that you can organise, a solution space where people can actually look and feel and touch. If you can't actually see what a new piece of technology does, it's not nearly as effective. You want to be able to walk into an exhibition hall and see, oh my God, look at that. That's a new, whatever it is, car, plane, whatever it is, and it works like this, and you could talk to someone. I mean, really, face-to-face meeting is even more important now that we can communicate constantly online. And if you really do want to bring people together to solve complex problems, then you need to meet face-to-face, and that is going to mean traveling, obviously. So I feel like that's the aviation problem is very, very difficult to resolve But sometimes I think we take positions that are just completely unrealistic and not effective. And I'd like to think that the innovation cycle is moving very fast in traditional fossil fuel-based aviation and its alternatives. And there's a lot we could do to make the system more efficient. Maybe AI could help with that too. But I think we have to accept that aviation is actually a remarkably valuable system for our economy and society. And it's just extremely difficult to imagine not having it.
I agree, but it is just something I feel so guilty about. I guess it's such a visible symbol of high carbon consumption.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, me as an individual, so again, for work, as we all work remotely, each year we calculate our individual carbon footprints and then offset those as a company, because we don't have company emissions. It's kind of just our individual emissions. And I don't fly loads, maybe 3, maybe 4 times a year if it was a heavier year for flying. But that's 60, 70% of my carbon emissions, just those couple of flights. And it is just kind of the easiest way of me reducing my emissions is just not to fly. I mean, that just has such a big impact on my individual footprint if I just make the decision to not go by plane or to not go on that trip. So I find it really hard to justify. I agree with what you're saying, and I do value face-to-face meetings, but it's trying to justify that to myself. Is it really worth it? I guess because you can't calculate the environmental benefit of that meeting in the same way that you can.
Anyway. Do you think there's a generational shift? Or is it too hard to say? I.e., more people who think, I'm not going to fly.
Well, I guess Greta is the
I know.
is
she's
the
the strongest
sailing
advocate.
across the Atlantic rather than flying. But I was trying to think about this, and I mean, there's definitely the awareness. We can't deny the fact that there's a huge environmental impact from flying, and we know about it. But I'm not sure. I think I've got friends that do try and take the train, but no is the quick answer. I think we still value flying and going on trips and exploring the world, and most people are not changing their behaviors. So we're relying on that innovation, I guess, as you spoke about.
I just think of having lived in Singapore for many years, the aspirations of growing middle class there, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, obviously China. These are large, well, in the case of Indonesia, very large populations having the means now to travel. India, of course, would be another classic example. I can't see that being tamed in any way. I just think it's going to happen.
And as you say, I'm not sure it should be.
I'm not sure it should be. I could see real breakthroughs happening in all those areas we've touched upon, in material science, in design, in types of aircraft, more variety of small aircraft, more efficient to fly the distances, particularly for the kind of internal travel in a big continent like the US or China or India, where there's a lot of internal flights. I can see real innovation happening there, bringing the carbon costs down of that kind of flight. I don't hold out great hopes for hydrogen on bigger vehicles, although I've seen, and this may be very marginal, but I'm quite attracted to the airships that are being developed. There's one here, I think it's in Northampton, a production company that is building electric drivetrain airships, which are particularly useful actually for freight. They carry very heavy loads, and they can be positioned to where they can deliver. If you imagine an airship carrying pipelines, that sounds ironic, carrying heavy goods to a particular place. They can fly those bits of kit to infrastructure, for example, and deliver them there, directly. Far, far fewer emissions. You could even imagine airships coming into the luxury travel area too, flying slowly rather than quickly. I can see that happening as a change of taste. Maybe you need some sort of taste maker showing off that they're traveling down the Rift Valley in a airship, and isn't it wonderful, isn't the view beautiful? Because you can, if you've been in a balloon, that feeling. It's rather remarkable. So there may well be things at the margin there too that are interesting and might change a few behaviours. But I'm afraid we look like we're committed to an increase in aviation usage and therefore in climate change effect. And it's going to be very hard to turn that down.
Yeah. The IPCC has sort of 4 areas of reduction for flying. The technological improvements that we've talked about, the better aerodynamics, lighter aircrafts, alternative fuels, which we briefly touched on, like sustainable aviation fuels and using hydrogen or electric planes. Operational changes, again, we spoke about the changing the flight routes and adjustments to reduce those contrails. And then the 4th one is regulatory and economic measures.
Yeah.
So something that is talked about a bit is this idea of frequent flyer levies.
Yes, a levy,
and taxes
a tax, on usage.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, we've talked before about carbon pricing, and which does exist in the aviation industry. There is a carbon price, and it is, it collects quite a lot of revenue.
But flying's so cheap. So it's obviously not high enough.
It's not a deterrent, yeah.
I mean, often flying is still staggeringly cheap to Europe. And
I mean, that is a fact. It is inexpensive and sometimes really inexpensive. Carbon pricing would equalize a bit. There would be an adverse reaction. The public wouldn't like it if the prices went up. Certainly not here, where we've got used to low prices, particularly for the discount airlines, the airlines that really build their whole business around low prices. That'll be a challenge because obviously it's a form of taxation, isn't it? But it's pretty damn obvious that the aviation industry does not pay the proper price for its environmental effects. And the attempts to get that in place over many, many years have always fallen short. I mean, yes, there is a carbon price now. What's called CORSIA. We can put in the notes the system that they have. And airlines, pay. But it's not sufficient.
Well, one thing we've spoken about, which is complicated about the aviation industry, is the fact that international flights are not assigned to any one country. And so they are exempt from the international treaties like the Paris Agreement, for example. And apparently 65% of CO2 emissions from aviation is emitted by international flights or international airspace. So no country is taking full responsibility for those emissions.
Talk about a gap in the system. Yeah. So when we see these national accounts, they're all saying, "Oh, no, aviation, that's not us,"
And you were saying how, again, the UK, we've reduced our emissions.
UK's got some really good numbers about their percentage of emission reductions since 1990. It's really impressive.
Yeah.
But
it's not including our flights to
doesn't include
everywhere.
Aviation, doesn't include shipping. And obviously, as we talked about in previous episodes, it doesn't include the things that are made somewhere else now that perhaps used to be made in our jurisdiction, but they're not. They're made in China or India or Vietnam or Bangladesh, and we import them and consume them here. Those aren't counted in our national accounting of carbon. But all that really tells you is that we are in a global economy. We're we've always been in a global economy, albeit one that for a period in our history we had very powerful control over. I'm not very sympathetic to the sort of anti-globalization strain of thought in environmentalism. It doesn't resonate with me. I'm actually attracted to enterprise that crosses borders, that connects people of all different types. To my mind, it's a better way for human beings to exist, to be able to openly and freely and willingly trade with each other and figure out who they are and why they're interesting and different. I just I don't like and feel very nervous about this backlash that is definitely happening. And nationalism never ends well, in my view. So I think many of the stats that we reference, I don't necessarily want to see as negative. I want to see them as being positive aspects of us working together, doing business together, trading with each other. They're all good. But the consequences for a single atmosphere and for the whole of humanity have to be dealt with. You have to manage that. You have to recognize that wherever that emission takes place, it finishes up in an atmosphere that we all live under. So having some kind of international system for pricing carbon would be great. And we nearly got it. Well, we got it for a while and then it went away, and who knows, we might get some of it back again. The aviation industry is a classic example. It should pay its own way as an industry, but the governments need to be straight with their publics that it's necessary to work with other governments to get that to really make a difference. And you have to have some guts. You have to have some courage to say, no, you will pay a proper price, not a easily discarded one.
So if we're talking about government decisions, we should probably mention the UK and the conversations happening here in terms of expanding
Heathrow,
our airports and Heathrow specifically. I saw that offsetting the expansion of Heathrow, Gatwick and Luton would need a forest twice the size of Greater London. That's more trees than the UK has planted since 2000.
We got ourselves in. We've been talking about this third runway for how many years? I mean, decades.
Oh,
it's not years; it's decades.
Yeah,
and it seems almost impossible to resolve. And some of the reasoning I find really quite strange, because we don't really have any kind of proper coordination between our airports. They're individually owned. They're competitors. And we somehow bought this idea that was good for the economy. But it's really difficult to properly manage a transport system when you have an outright competition between owners of airports who have incentives to get more. We may not need new capacity at Heathrow if capacity can be increased elsewhere. But until somebody just makes that decision, you're constantly left with proposals that then have to be individually evaluated. And I've seen recently that funny enough, I did actually at some stage provide advice to Heathrow on sustainability. And I went up into the control tower to see the operations, the amazing operations there. Very, very, intense concentration of all the air traffic controllers. But from there, you can see the two runways in operation. Then you can also see where the third runway was proposed, because the land is visible from the control tower, and it's just, anyway. And it would involve, if they ever do build it, it will involve, clearing more houses, and there's lots of, take a long time to get that done, even when they finally get permission to do it. And I asked the air traffic controller guy, just say this takes another 10 years or more if it ever gets built. How are you going to build in to that design innovation in aircraft? What about electric aircraft? They move in a very different way. They don't need a very long runway. They take off at a sort of 45-degree angle. I mean, they not every instance, but they don't need so much runway, and they move very differently to the other conventional aircraft. And he said, oh, well, I'd need a whole new system because I would need to manage those movements in a very different way. And they'll have less noise, so they'll be able to fly lower. I'd need a whole new system. And it occurred to me that, yeah, you absolutely would. It would be a very different way of moving vehicles around. But you'd hardly ever hear that in the discussion.
No, I've never heard that before.
It's just the assumption is we're going to build this runway and it's going to do exactly what we do now. And yet in 10 years' time, I bet you it's not there. And things will have moved on. And we still don't seem to be able to coordinate our infrastructure. It's just bitty and projecty, rather than systemic. And so I find the debate really unsatisfying. I want a proper discussion about whether we really do need it in a system, not in a single space. What about the other airports? What about new types of aircraft? What about the alternatives that might lie in rail transport? I mean, there was a time, it was quite brief, where I think I remember John Prescott really hammering home this integrated transport policy. And he was mocked a little bit for it because he was not quite as articulate as the clever people around him. But actually he was fundamentally right. And I don't want to make that in a party political sense. I just felt like that was a kind of common sense approach that he adopted just a few years ago, obviously. So I don't feel as if the debate's properly settled yet. It doesn't seem to be really up to date with what is going on in the aviation industry as well as in the management of our transport economy.
Yeah, whether that's just that the government doesn't have much faith in the innovation.
I don't know.
It's
presented as a growth strategy.
Mm-hmm.
And, I can see, there is obviously a logic in that, more movements, and we've clearly dropped down the global rankings in airports, and you only have to travel to some of the other ones to see, the newer ones are better in almost every regard. So there's some sense of sort of fear or worry about British decline that somehow needs to be lifted by an enterprise like this. I'm open-minded about the need question, but I'd love to see a more innovative approach to how we would manage the overall demand of aviation in the country. And even we just had a single piece of analysis of whether or not aircraft that can be powered by alternative means, electric and hydrogen, usually in combination, are likely to feature in the use of that runway. I'd like to know about whether some work had been done on that. Perhaps it has been going on, we just haven't heard about it.
Yeah. I think for me, my instinct reaction is to be quite anti there being an additional runway at Heathrow, but then at the same time, I do still fly. So that feels hypocritical of me to be anti that expansion when I'm not stopping my consumption, I suppose.
I think so much depends on the kind of analysis that you'd wish to see. These reports took years. The inquiries took years, and yet they were just there was a disappointing lack of coordination between the various ways in which our airports function, where they are, who owns them, who's making the decisions as to where resources get deployed. And it's just vaguely unsatisfactory at the end of it all that we're still arguing about this.
Yeah.
And don't really know what the right answer is yet. I find that it's baffling to me. I'm probably not as negative, not instinctively against.
Yeah.
But not convinced either.
Okay.
How about that?
The best thing to do is to fly less.
Less. We got less again. Yeah.
But if we can't fly less for whatever reason, whether, it's an important journey to take, then there are innovations happening in terms of sustainable fuel, flight routes, technology changes to the aircrafts themselves that should maybe give us hope on the future of flying.
Yeah. Demand is going to increase. We better have some answers to make the system more efficient. And probably those of us who do the flying need to do less.
Thank you so much for listening to Fossil versus Future. Please subscribe to our podcast and give us a rating. And please follow us on social media. Let us know the questions that you want answers to or that you'd like us to discuss.